sitting in the cafeteria together. It's almost like they're still plotting. Two or three can't even sit together without that idea coming forward. In any case, just to conclude with regard to this book, it talks a lot about how the Africans in North America were engaged in shipboard insurrections as the slave owners are trying to transport them from the breeding colony that was Virginia to the slave market, the wall market of North America in terms of enslaved persons, which is New Orleans, and how they would have shipboard insurrections and perhaps even kill their captors, sell them to Bahamas. They'd be met by the West Indian regiments and Negroes with guns and redcoats who could free them, causing increased conflict between London and Washington, and perhaps bringing the two powers to war once again, or a ship being blown off course from the breeding colony that is Virginia as they're being transported to New Orleans, blown off course into Bermuda, and the same thing happens. Once again, these conflicts arising. This was a repeated theme in the run-up to the Civil War. In fact, one of the points that I tried to stress in this comrades book is that the so-called irrepressible conflict, which we have been taught was between North and South, leading to the U.S. Civil War. I'm sort of revising that, saying the irrepressible conflict was between the South, the slave-owning South, and really, on the one hand, and the Negroes in London on the other, not least because there's so much pro-slavery sentiment in the North. New York, as you know, was a major port for the importation of ships for the illegal African slave trade, almost up to the day of the attack on Fort Sumter in 1861. Ships were being built in Maine for the slave trade, and so, and I'm sure you know about the anti-Negro riots that took place in New York City during the height of the Civil War. Negroes being strung from the lampposts, immolated, incinerated in New York City, supposedly the citadel of abolition. So, in any case, that's a thumbnail sketch of that book. Now, let me move to Hawaii. There's a prequel to this book, a book that I wrote a few years ago called The White Pacific, U.S. Imperialism and Black Slavery in the South Seas after the Civil War. And it tells the story about this, that because the slave trade was so profitable, these slave traders in the United States, they took the Keith Sweat approach to the slave trade. Make it last forever. Even after the Civil War, they wanted to continue because the profits were so stupendous and stupefying. I mean, 1,600, 1,700%. I'm sure you've lived in the United States long enough to know that people will sell their firstborn for 1,600% profit. And so what happens is that many of them decamp to the South Seas, where they begin to enslave the Melanesians, people who look like many of us in this room, and some Polynesians, dragging them to Fiji, the South Seas, and to Queensland, Australia, as bonded laborers. The Kingdom of Hawaii objects. The Kingdom of Hawaii is a very sophisticated polity. The infrastructure was probably as developed in the archipelago as it was in the mainland in the late 19th century, which is the era that I'm addressing. And for its troubles, the Kingdom of Hawaii was deposed in the 1890s with this objection by the kingdom to this kind of slave trade being one of the central reasons. And the kingdom becomes a colony of the United States. And then, as you know, the state, the 50th and presumably final state of the United States of America in 1959, I should add parenthetically that all of us know that the U.S. president is from Hawaii. Born in 1961, although, as you know, some of his critics dispute that. And it's interesting, when I was doing talks about this book and the run-up to publication, I would always get these questions from the right wing about this book. Because they have these questions about the lineage of this book, and also his political orientation, etc. So there were a lot of pre-orders for this book, although I kept saying. So you didn't tell. And the book ends in 59, he was born in 61. So you can draw your own conclusions from that. But in any case, one of the reasons is this, because of the radical political heritage of Hawaii. What happens in the 1930s is that San Francisco, the International Longshore Warehouse Union, headed by Harry Bridges, born in Melbourne, comes to the United States, meets general strike in San Francisco, starts the ILWU, sends organizers to the archipelago. They quickly organize these exploited laborers because the parts of Hawaii in the 1930s and 1940s was basically an apartheid society. A tiny European minority at the top of the socioeconomic pyramid, exploiting shamelessly and mercilessly thousands of workers, sugar plantations, pineapple plantations, predominantly of Asian Pacific descent. What happens is that after that organizing convinces and the union begins to gain strength, there's worry in Washington about the orientation of Hawaii. Beginning in the 1930s, there's been a lot of talk about Hawaii becoming a state. After the left begins to gain traction, there's second and third thoughts about this. And one can almost imagine that there's sort of a repressed memory syndrome operating on the part of the right wing in the United States, because Hawaii was sort of the problem issue for these United States of America for decades, leading up to 1959, even after 1959, because of the strength of the left and radical movement, a strength that was not equaled on the mainland by far. So I talk about that story and the labor organizing and the run-up to a state of 1959, and I'll just end on this point. One of my characters in this book is Frank Marshall Davis, Black American born in Kansas, achieves prominence in Chicago, and then moves to Honolulu. And of course, just by stating those bare facts, you can imagine why the right wing was interested in this book, because in Dreams of My Father, the Obama memoir, he talks about a character by the name of Frank, who's actually Frank Marshall Davis, and how Frank Marshall Davis is a friend of his father, a friend of the family, and how he talks about Richard Wright, who, of course, Frank Marshall Davis was very close to, Black American novelists, and all the writers from the Chicago Renaissance of the 1930s, etc. So then, if you go home and put his name and perhaps my name in the search engine, you'll come up with all these hysterical comments about current occupant of the White House and how he's a Manchurian candidate because of his connection with Frank Marshall Davis. But in any case, I'll stop there. Are there any comments or questions? We can entertain them at this point. Yes, sir.
When you started with the Hawaii work, what did you find about the interaction and cooperation and tension between the different ethnic groups, Japanese, Filipinos, and students of Brazilians, who are all part of the labor movement in terms of putting aside differences or attempts to exploit that? What did you find on that side?
So the question is about the relations between and amongst the various ethnic groups in Hawaii, such as those of Japanese origin, who, by the way, are the plurality today in the archipelago and have been since the 1880s, when the then Kingdom of Hawaii was trying to block being seized by the United States and was working out this deal with Tokyo, which led to these workers coming across the Pacific. And then the Filipino population, whose numbers grow in the archipelago, particularly after the War of 1898, the United States seizes the Philippines from Spain, but also after World War II. Now, it's interesting, the sugar barons tried to stoke conflict between amongst the Japanese, those of Japanese origin and those of Filipino origin. And this was particularly after the Filipino population began arriving in the wake of World War II, because there had been this brutal occupation by Japanese imperial forces in the Philippines in 1941, 1945. But it turns out that that stoking of conflict really didn't take off the way the sugar barons wanted to take off. One of the issues that I put forward in this book is that you had a lot of progressive white men in the ILWU leadership. And interestingly enough, they were always pressing for the workers of Japanese origin to take a step back so that